Hi all, welcome back to another episode of Pet Squares, our first one since the passing of the Beach Boys founder and visionary leader, Brian Wilson. And perhaps there is no better way to honor his memory than to dedicate a show to what is arguably his greatest achievement, the pinnacle of his artistic and commercial arc, if you will, the October 1966 single by the Beach Boys, Good Vibrations. Good Vibrations was a watershed moment in pop music history. It is widely regarded as one of the greatest singles of all time. Certainly a turning point in the 1960s. Many would argue it is the first progressive pop single. It was certainly the first pop record that used the classical style of having individual movements within a piece. The concept of a pop single as art rock or as art in and of itself. Outside of what the Beatles were doing, this was the first major hit that had this sort of arty progressive component to it. It's really hard to overstate the song's influence in pop music history. It was a massive hit. It went to #1 in the United States, in the UK, also in France, New Zealand, Malaysia, Spain, top 5 in many other countries in the world, despite its length. Its 3-minute and 35-second running time were seen to be prohibitive to be played on AM radio, where most songs came in under 3 minutes, and if they didn't, they lied on the label and they said it was under 3 minutes. The record was in gestation for about 7 months. It was the most expensive single up to that time. It cost anywhere between $10,000 and $50,000 to make, which is an enormous amount of money back then. By comparison, Pet Sounds, which up to that time had been the most expensive album ever made, cost something along the lines of $70,000. So this was somewhere between 10 to 50, probably around 20 to make one song. But what a song it was. It was the first use in rock of the cello as a lead instrument. It was the first use of the electro-theremin, basically a monophonic ribbon synthesizer played with your finger that was constructed to emulate the sound of a theremin, which is an instrument that was primarily used in horror movies that would change its tone based on how close or far away your hand was to the mechanism. And it had a little antenna that you would move your hand towards and away from, and it would make a kind of ghostly vibrato sound like woo, like that, right? I talked about this a lot in the Pet Sounds episode where we talked about the song I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, which was the first song Brian used this instrument on, and in fact his first session for Good Vibrations was just 2 days after he had done that song. Also, it's interesting, not widely discussed, but the use of a jaw harp, this little thing that goes twang, you put in your mouth, boing, 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 like that. Not a widely used instrument in rock and roll. In some of the early versions of this song, it was very prominent and sometimes worked better than others, but that's the kind of an instrument that was primarily used in movie and television soundtracks, just as was the theremin. And it's, again, another indication of how much Brian's writing around this time was probably influenced by television and film. This song, of course, because of its importance in music history, has been widely discussed and analyzed. Therefore, it's surprising to me that not much is really known about the writing process for it. We know that Brian smoked a big old doobie before he wrote it. He said this is not an LSD-influenced song, it's a marijuana-influenced song. Fair enough, Brian. We know that the term Good Vibrations arose because Brian's mother, Audrey, when Brian was a child, used to tell him stories about how dogs would react certain ways to individual human beings because they got vibrations from that person and reacted accordingly, and that stuck with Brian. But it's not really clear when he wrote this or under what conditions. We talked in the Pet Sounds episodes that there's this missing 6 months in the end of 1965 where Brian was developing ideas for Pet Sounds. We know that Good Vibrations, the recording for it, began in mid-February in the midst of the Pet Sounds sessions. It was very briefly, for about 2 weeks considered for the track listing of Pet Sounds before it was dropped. So that does indicate to me that Brian probably was working this song up during the end of 1965, during the period when he's coming up with ideas for Pet Sounds. It's clearly a song that he had a musical concept for in advance of the lyrics. He had started out with the idea of good vibes. Tony Asher was the one that convinced him to change it to Good Vibrations. He thought that was a little more in tune with the times. Asher wrote a set of lyrics for the song. He also came up with the first of two hooks for the chorus, the good, 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 good vibrations. And it should be noted that Asher was not credited for his contributions. Most of them were overwritten by Mike Love, but if we're going to be fair, Mike Love has retroactively been accorded credit to quite a number of Beach Boys songs on the basis of fairly minor, although in many cases quite consequential contributions. It does seem to me that if Mike could be accorded writer's credit for Wouldn't It Be Nice, which was 98% written by Tony Asher, Asher could have been afforded the same courtesy here, but he wasn't. That's just kind of how the cookie crumbles. As far as I know, Asher never legally pursued it. But anyway, this was the first song where Brian, instead of conceiving the whole song as a whole and then bringing it in the studio and cutting the track either with the Beach Boys or studio musicians or some combination thereof, and cutting it all basically in one session or possibly two sessions if things didn't go well the first one. And then you'd have the track and then the Beach Boys would overdub the vocals and that would be that. In this case, Brian decided to do the song in sections, and we're going to see as we go through the session history of this song how that evolved. Now, when Brian decided to remove Good Vibrations from consideration for the Pet Sounds track listing, several parties were unhappy about this. Capitol Records, the Beach Boys label, had gotten wind of the existence of this song, and they apparently were excited enough about it that it seems to have influenced their lackluster, to say the least, promotion for Pet Sounds. It was a factor in them not releasing a single from Pet Sounds after its release, which was part of the reason Pet Sounds did not perform as well as previous Beach Boys albums, until July, when they reluctantly released Wouldn't It Be Nice, which became a fairly substantial hit and helped keep Pet Sounds in the charts, but probably would have done more good a couple months earlier. It's clear that Capitol kind of wanted to get shot of the whole Pet Sounds experience and move on to this Good Vibrations thing, which looked like it might make them some money. Two of the band members, Al Jardine and Bruce Johnston, have expressed regret that Good Vibrations was not included on Pet Sounds, since they believe it would have helped the Pet Sounds album to achieve greater sales. I don't really agree with this. I don't think Good Vibrations really belongs on Pet Sounds. I think it would be even more of an outlier than Sloop John B was, for several reasons. First of all, lyrically it doesn't fit the flow of the album. Even Sloop John B, if you close your eyes and shrivel up your nose a little bit, you can see how it fits with the concept of trying to grow up and then pessimistically deciding it's not worth it. That is the overriding theme of Pet Sounds. You can kind of see where it fits in. Good Vibrations is a fairly straightforward and kind of metaphysical boy-girl love song. There's not really any sense of pessimism in it at all. There's more of a sense of wonder. It's only deep in the sense of what it suggests that you can't touch or feel. Good Vibrations, both in the way it was written and in the way it was produced and structured, really has much more in common with the Smile album project that Brian embarked on after Pet Sounds than it does with Pet Sounds. It's not just that Brian recorded it in a different way. From the get-go, it was a song that, as I said, was comprised of different movements, but each one of those movements had a fairly simplistic structure. So you don't have the, and we'll get into this when I analyze the chords and everything for the song in a few minutes, but it doesn't have the harmonic complexity to the individual parts that Pet Sounds had. There's the elements of it are pretty basic, and also the song's quite a bit edgier than Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds is kind of a dreamy, lush, gauzy, softer on the edges, album. Now, Good Vibrations has really dreamy parts of it, like the verse, for example, with Carl Wilson's gossamer vocal kind of floating above it. It's like, oh, I'm floating on a cloud. That's a little bit like Pet Sounds, but the R&B influenced chorus, theremin is kind of right in your face. The cello's da 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 da. I mean, it's not a rock instrument, but it's a rockin' part, right? The percussiveness of the piano and the boom, boom, boom pulse that you hear there, and towards the end of the song, that's rock. There's nothing subtle about that. There's nothing, I mean, Carol Kay is right when she says the bass feel in the chorus is jazz influence, but most of Good Vibrations is about very basic beats, very basic chords. How many times do we have a pulse, like a half beat pulse? Dong, dong. That's headbanging. I mean, not like it's not metal, but that's rock. When you have something that thuddy, right? It rocks harder, it's edgier, it's lyrically just cut from a different cloth. It's in one way, it has much less emotional depth, as Paul McCartney pointed out, than Pet Sounds, but the words sort of function on this ethereal level, which kind of Pet Sounds is not. The lyrics on Pet Sounds are pretty down to earth, and that may be why, even though I would argue Tony Asher is a superior lyricist to Mike Love, Mike Love's lyrics to Good Vibrations are clearly superior to Tony Asher's. Asher's are a little too on the nose for the track. There's a more implied mysticism in the imagery that Mike manages to conjure up, even though it's been argued by Bruce Johnston mostly that Mike Love should have had a crack at Pet Sounds. I don't think he was the right guy for that, but he was the right guy for Good Vibrations. Let's get to the recording. 30 different musicians played on various sessions involving 90 hours of tape. I'm going to now read down the list of the people that played on the finished recording, which was called together from several different sessions. I'll talk about which ones later. On tack piano and tambourine, Brian Wilson. 12-string electric guitar and possibly shakers, Carl Wilson. Hammond organ was played by Dennis Wilson on the churchy breakdown, and Larry Nichtel on the other parts of the song. Tack piano, Mike Melvoin, Al DeLore, and Van Dyke Parks on additional tack piano, because you can never have enough tack piano. That's 4 tack pianists. By the way, tack piano, in case you don't know, it's I think it's also called prepared piano. You put these, you put tacks basically on. I'm trying to remember how this works. If it's on I think it's on the hammers of the piano. So that, yeah, I think it's the back end of the tack. In other words, you shove the tack into the felt beaters of the piano. I mean, this is my impression. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it up here. And then when the tacks hit the piano strings instead of the felt beaters, and it gives it more clanky sound. And so you really hear that on again, the first bridge, that kind of wild sort of gauzy, crisp sound of the piano. That's the tack piano sound. It's different. So we got 4 tack pianists on it. The very key cello triplets are played by Jesse Ehrlich. The key electrotheremin part is played by Paul Tanner. In fact, another name for that instrument is the Tannerin, because basically he invented it, and he was the only guy that played it for a while. On bass, bunch of people. Ray Pullman on Fender bass, Lyle Ritz on upright and Fender bass, depending on the sessions. Jimmy Bond on upright bass, Bill Pittman on Dano 6-string bass. 2 drummers, Hal Blaine played drums on parts of it, along with shakers on, I believe, the breakdown that Dennis played on as well. Jim Gordon played drums as well as sleigh bells. Frank Capp played bongos and tambourine, again, depending on the session. Tambourine, Terry Melcher, Bruce's buddy, and Steve Douglas. Electric guitars, besides Carl, we've got Al Casey and Jerry Cole. The estimable Mr. Tommy Morgan on bass harmonica, and jaw harp, which used to have a less flattering name, but anyway. So if you've heard of a different name, you were right. Piccolo flutes, baritone sax, some combination, and I should say this is coming from my old buddy Craig Slawinski, who is the world's foremost authority on Beach Boys sessions, who often consults with this show, and I assume coming from his crack research team of Jocelyn Hoisington, John Brode, and Will Carrar. Anyway, they report that it is some combination of Jay Migliore, Bill Green, Jim Horn, Plas Johnson, and Steve Douglas. Left out a bassist above, another bassist, Fender bass, Arthur Wright, Gary Coleman, very famous percussion player on sleigh bells, and an instrument called a cimbalom by a guy named Emil Richards. And I had to look up what a cimbalom is. It's something like a dulcimer. It's another one of those hammer onto strings kind of instruments. And I'll post a picture of it up here. I'd never heard of it before, and I looked up where it's heard on the track because I wanted to make sure if it was really there, right? Because I'd never heard of this thing, and it's at the end where the do 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 do, that part right there where you've just got one note pulsing, dong 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 dong. It's part of that. It's going dong 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 dong. So it's in there. That's where I believe it is. You may notice some names missing from the list. Musicians that were recorded but not used include Tony Asher, who did some percussion on an early take, Billy Strange on guitar, and Carol Kay, who played bass and guitar and has credited herself on this record, and she did indeed play on sessions for it, but the experts agree, and they're very firm on this, she does not appear on the final version. Now, not to cast aspersions on Miss Kay, who has been accused at times of exaggerating her credits, which she doesn't need to do because she was on like an ungodly number of tracks from the 60s. She did indeed play on the sessions, and she probably would have no way of knowing whether or not she was on the finished product, so I don't think her crediting herself for this track is in any way meant to be deceptive. I think it's an honest mistake. Okay, so let's now go down through all the sessions and see how the finished product of Good Vibrations evolved. The first session for the song took place in the middle of the Pet Sounds sessions, and it was on February 17th, 1966, with some vocal overdubs, I believe, taking place on March 3rd. As I said, it was only in the running for Pet Sounds for those 2 weeks, and I think it was the 2 weeks during which they cut this track, and then Carl and Brian put vocals on it, listened back, and it just was kind of something missing. Now, the verses were basically the same as what was on the finished product. Everything was there right from the get-go for that, other than the lyrics, which are still Tony Asher's and are a little awkward. Also, on this original version, when it gets to the chorus, it speeds up a little bit, which is feels a little weird. There's a dissonant line behind the theremin. Later on, I'll ask if it's clarinets. It was not clarinets. I believe it was flutes. Counterpunctual to the theremin. Ooh, you get this da 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 da, and that bottom note is really strange. This melody line stays in the song up until fairly close to the end. In fact, you hear a tiny little bit of it on the finished product at the very end of the song, the fade out. I think this is another thing that just didn't work. This whole one thing goes up, another thing goes down, kind of dueling melodies is something Brian did a lot, especially in vocals, but here you took focus away from the theremin in an unlovely way. The falsetto echoes the theremin. There's like a kind of an answering line, which is kind of cool. The jaw harp is very prominent on this version, and it's kind of goofy. It's not really working. It's bordering on novelty in spots. It's kind of strange. A lot of people have commented on how kind of out there the original track sounded and how much more R&B it sounded. That's very true. It also has kind of a strange breakdown in the end. It just kind of suddenly comes in, everything kind of drops down, and it sounds a little disorganized. And you'll see this again as we progress through the sessions, that there's places where clearly Brian wants something to happen, but he hasn't quite worked out what it is. Now, at this point, the chorus has not gone into its ascending modulations. It's basically more similar to the first bridge, where it's just good, 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 good vibrations, and it goes to the four, going good, 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 good vibrations, good, good. So it's basically the part that comes after the chorus on the finished product is roughly what the chorus is on the original version. So again, you can see how this is starting to evolve. He's got a bunch of ideas. The verses sound right. There's definitely got something going on with the theremin. the melody. The hook is good. So all those things that are kept, those are obviously working. But a bunch of the other things, it's almost like Brian's just trying a little too hard to be weird. He hasn't figured it out yet. And you start to see why this song took 7 months to complete. It wasn't just Brian being obsessive. There's a problem-solving aspect to this production that each iteration of the song addresses, right? I want to add also on this version of the song, Carl played some bass guitar on the chorus. And Carl played bass on this song live for a while. When they did the song live, Bruce would play the organ part. So someone had to play the bass part. Usually in situations like this, Al would play the bass. But so it's a little weird to see Carl playing bass live. You rarely see this. There is a clip of him somewhere playing the bass part, and they're lip syncing, but he is playing the bass on this. I think there might be a couple of different versions from the 60s where you see Carl playing bass, but this partly explains why he did it. And also I think it might have been a little technically beyond Al's ability, although Al was pretty good at this, the bass is pretty intricate. I mean, it's the lead instrument for the verse. It's moving around quite a bit in the chorus. I mean, it's not as crazy as some of the other Pet Sounds bass lines. It's not as hard to play as say Sloop John B is, but it still required a good deal of technical ability to sing and play it. So between the fact that Carl already knew the part and had played on the record, even though that part wasn't used, Carl, I think in this period when they were starting to move Bruce over to keyboards and they were trying to do the Pet Sound stuff, played bass on a few other things. I believe there's a clip of him playing bass on God Only Knows. And again, I think that's sort of a similar situation where the bass line's so pivotal to the song that Carl decided he needed to be the one to do it. He felt he could do a better job than Al. And no disrespect to Al, Carl's a better musician than Al. And I don't think Al would argue the point. Moving on, April 9th. This is the second and last attempt Brian makes to do the song all in one go. The April 9th session is dreamier sounding than the first one. The verse has theremin in it too. There's like the little spooky line behind it. There's some counterpoint with woodwinds there. So there's a lot more motion in the verse. The drums are a lot busier on this version. I gotta say, I think it's Hal in this, but whoever it was, they're not really in the pocket. They're kind of all over the place. There's quite a few flubs on it. Pretty busy as well. That dissonant counterpoint I talked about with the flutes, not clarinets, is still there. Now the chorus modulations that we hear on the final record are now there. The third section is now there, so Brian has moved his original chorus concept to the first bridge. And now the harmonica, played by Tommy Morgan, is very prominent and it's a featured instrument during the bridge. And there are now two crazy breakdowns at the end where Brian's like trying to do something wild with the harmonica being heavily featured there as well. It's really intriguing but kind of jarring, especially after the second one comes in, because again, they have this feeling of Brian going, I want to do something here, but I'm not quite sure what it is, but here's something weird for now. And I think this contributes again to Brian's feeling that he needs to sit down and address these parts separately, because parts of it are working and parts of it aren't, and he wants to do something really cool for this middle section, but he doesn't quite know what he wants to do. So you hear that again on this. At the end of the this version, I alluded to the drumming being kind of wild, and I believe it's Hal Blaine. It goes pretty crazy at the end, but that actually presages the live arrangement that was very powerful that the Beach Boys got into in the 70s, where Dennis would do this cross tom-tom thing, which actually pretty technically impressive. It's like thump 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 bump thump bump, syncopated tom-tom beat against the main rhythm, and Carl would kind of scat over it. That has its origins in this version where Hal's kind of doing a similar thing. He's getting kind of jazzy on the toms. One of the reasons the Beach Boys in the 70s were so good is because they were focusing more on the later material. They really sat down and worked out arrangements that solved a lot of the problems. The way these tracks were done dealt to the band when they first had to like try to play Good Vibrations live or Heroes and Villains live or Wouldn't It Be Nice live. And Wouldn't It Be Nice, I talked about this in Pet Sounds, they used to leave out the place where the song slowed down because they couldn't figure out how to make it work live. And then in the 70s, when they sat down and thought about it, they realized they could milk that part and just da 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 bah! See, so and that sold the song live, right? It made it a much more powerful song. And there's parts of Good Vibrations that are like that. The churchy breakdown, they turned into a big sing-along part. They really milked that part. You got the ending part where, again, they incorporate some of the earlier, more frenetic takes to create excitement and power. And also with the cellos, triplets were duplicated live on the guitar. And again, that gave it this real momentum to it. So it was an interesting process the Beach Boys had to go through. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. But when they finally started figuring out how to arrange these tunes and figured out the places in the original arrangements that could really be turned from liabilities to assets when they're presenting it to an audience. Maybe the biggest example of this is Heroes and Villains. And I'm going to talk about this when we get into Smile. What a problem finishing that track became for Brian, and one of the big reasons was the loss of momentum in the chorus. And we're going to see in a minute when I get back to talking about Good Vibrations, that was a problem for this song too. In Heroes and Villains, it's kind of extreme because Brian wanted putting in a chorus that's kind of influenced a bit by the breakdown, the later breakdown of Good Vibrations with the organ. So it took things too far down and slowed them down too much. And when the Beach Boys did Heroes and Villains in the 70s, they kept it at tempo and brought this kind of rock thing into it where they go dunk, 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 dunk. And they leaned into sort of the drama of the mystery of the melody line and kind of the ominousness of the chord progression, and they turned it into something really powerful. They basically solved a problem that Brian never solved, because that's one of the reasons Heroes and Villains didn't work as well as Good Vibrations. Moving on that. Starting in May, and with the Pet Sounds project being wrapped up, Brian starts to record Good Vibrations in sections, which, as I said, becomes his mode of operation. Rather than tracking complete songs, he starts tracking bits and pieces. That turns into a problem later, but for now, I see from my own production experience, I understand why he did this. Because he had a good idea, but it wasn't flowing right. He couldn't get it all to pull together in one session. He needed to sit down and think about what he really wanted to do in these different parts. So there's in the first session in May, the bridge of the song, which up till now is kind of like floating around, it starts to take focus. They use the jaw harp again, and this time it sounds really cool. It doesn't sound goofy like it did before. One note pulse against the of the tambourine, that bit is now incorporated in. So that's starting to come together. Then there's some more stuff, and I want to particularly call attention to a recording that happened on May 27th, because a lot of this is Brian trying to work out what he wants to do in the bridge. He knows he wants to do something cool, but he can't quite figure out what. There's a really kind of astounding outtake from May 27th that's faster and more intense, and it builds in a more sort of on the nose way than Brian usually does. It's got swirling psychedelic woodwinds and similar groove to Heroes and Villains. You can really hear that kind of boom, boom thing happening behind it. And it really billows into something really exciting, and there's so much drama to it, and it's so cool. And it's so obvious why he dropped it, because he builds up to this big thing and he's got to drop back to the chorus, and it's like, good, good, good. So he's built the bridge up to this amazing thing, and then there's no payoff. Now we're just like, oh, now we're back into the chorus. And that was a problem, and we're going to see that problem, to me, as I listen to all these sessions, that was the main reason why Brian had so much trouble finishing this, and it was the same reason he had trouble finishing Heroes and Villains. You have to have the chorus pay off. You can't have a drop of energy at the end of the track. You got to keep it moving up. And so he got so into these bridges he was doing that the choruses just fell flat. But with this May 27th fragment, which I can't remember what it's on YouTube. If you seek it out, it's really cool, and it could have been a freestanding thing of its own. Since Brian dropped it, I'm sure he had forgotten about it by that time, but when he was trying to assemble Smile, it's the kind of thing he could have plucked out of that and put into another song like Heroes and Villains or something like that. This would have been a candidate for something he could have used to assemble Smile. I don't think anybody's ever gone back in any of their modern day assemblings of the Smile album and used this bit. Maybe they did, and I don't know, but to me, I'm just like, ooh, they should have used that. So in June, Brian continues to experiment with the bridge, and this is when he starts trying out fuzz bass as a lead element. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this dun 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 dun, and this is the point where he starts to find the counterpoint melody that ends the bridge, which in the record I think is harmonica and maybe something else. Here, I think it's a flute. I'm not sure what it is. It's whatever it is. It's really cool. It might be a flute, but the da 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 da, that kind of thing. So he's got that here. He also tries out a faster verse with a more staccato bass and organ, which is to say it's pretty much the same as what we hear in the record, but instead of like da 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 do do do, it's more like that like that, right? Doesn't really work, but it's a variation. Brian tries it, listens, and quite rightly says this ain't working. Now, during this period, the band is filmed in the studio doing some vocals, and you can see Dennis in that, who at one point was slated to sing the song, even though Carl sang lead on most of the original track with Brian. Apparently, Dennis was in the running at this point, and he's seen singing Asher's lyrics. And I believe this version's been released, but with the vocal take from the earlier ones flown in. I'm not quite sure how that worked, but anyway, I don't think there was ever a finished version per se of this version, but they may have constructed one later. Brian had all these intriguing ideas, but in an alarming precursor to what happened to Smile, they didn't fit together. And there's Capitol was thinking this was going to be their single, as I said before, and Brian gets to this point with it, and he's like, "This isn't working." And Carl said in an interview at the time, the song just didn't come out the way he wanted, and so Brian shelves Good Vibrations for 9 weeks, 2 months, during a period when the band really needs a hit single. And this is when Wouldn't It Be Nice comes out, and Best of the Beach Boys. And Brian actually considers scrapping the song, and until apparently Denny Hutton, Brian's singer friend, who he later produced in Redwood and who later became one of the lead singers in Three Dog Night, along with the other guys in Redwood. Danny Hutton wanted, or it's Denny Hutton. Anyway, Mr. Hutton, I can't remember if it's Danny or Denny, I'm sorry. Met the guy too, I still can't remember. In fact, his nephew helped get me signed. That's a completely different story. I should know whether it's Danny or Danny. Wait, I'm just gonna look it up. It's Danny. You all knew it was Danny, sorry. It's Danny Hutton, Danny Wilson. So anyway, at that point, he and I think maybe somebody else asked Brian if they could record it. And this seems to have motivated, because Brian was starting to struggle with insecurity quite a bit at this point. And so I think the voices in his head, and I don't mean the auditory hallucinations, although they might have been involved too, but just the self-doubt all of us have, was starting to say this song really isn't that good. And I can kind of see why he felt that way, because everybody who heard it from the very beginning could hear the commercial potential of it, but it didn't quite work. And Brian was a good producer. He knew it didn't quite work, and so he just was like, I don't know, I can't work this out. But at this point, Brian gets interested in it again. He's like, okay, I'm going to finish it off. And then he gets back to work on this in August, and at this point, the Smile album project is starting to get underway as well. So that's probably another motivating factor for Brian, having started work with Van Dyke, Parks on the Smile stuff, and starting to hear that was coming together and kind of going, oh, well, this is actually pretty good, and maybe I don't suck. Maybe I'm pretty good myself, Brian Wilson, and says maybe I better finish this thing. Brian gets back to work in August, and he starts recording new bits, and then there's a test edit of the work in progress that happens on the 24th of August. It still has the old lyrics. The chorus is similar to the final product. Brian's doing some kind of soul interjections in the chorus, which actually sound pretty good, but it's looser than what's on the record. It's got the it's still got the soul vibe going on that we don't get so much at the finished product. In fact, at one point, I think Brian thought of giving this song to Wilson Pickett. So you got Carl on the verses, you got the whole band on the choruses with Brian doing this kind of Wilson Pickett-y, shouty vocal thing in the background, and pulling off most of it. It's pretty cool. Carl's vocal is a little pitchy on the verse high notes. That note right there, he's a little flat on it. Probably not as flat as I just was, but that explains why in the final record, Brian takes over the part at that point, which is, you think is kind of strange because Carl's a really good singer. But remember, he's only 19, 20 years old at this point. He hadn't fully developed as a singer, so some of the rough edges aren't off yet. You hear this on the Wild Honey album where Carl's pitchy a lot of the time. So Carl, even though he does a great job on the vocal, doesn't quite nail the high notes on the verse in this version. Again, what we hear in the final version is an amalgam of Brian solving all these problems. So Brian, now solving this problem with Carl's vocal, takes over the high note on the verses for that bit. The bridge is very close to the finished product, but then it goes into the fuzz bass thing and the hum-de-dum, ho-wah chant, which you hear on the finished version of Smile that Brian released in 2004, I think was when that came out. And so this is really close to the ending, but it has the same problem that Brian has been facing all along. The bridge creates too much momentum and excitement for it to sustain when the chorus comes back in. Now this one isn't as bad because you got Brian doing all those Wilson Pickett-isms in the choruses, and that sort of creates a bit of excitement coming back into the closing choruses. So it doesn't drop quite as much, but still he's trying so hard to like soul out to lift the track up, but still the chorus is losing steam after this big bridge buildup. So Brian makes a really interesting and correct decision that finally pulls it together. He reaches a conclusion to this that I don't think he ever really found in Heroes and Villains, where he ran into the same basic problem. On September 1st, he decides, instead of going for this big showpiece bridge, he's going to strip everything way down to the basics. And that's when we get the gospel church breakdown with Dennis playing the organ and the heartbeat bass, just the straight quarter notes, and then the little seafaring harmonica, very, very simple. And then building up to that spine-chilling, ah, and then that space, and then back into the chorus. And now Brian's got it. Brian has found the missing piece because the momentum of the song has to go down before it can pay off. And all of the versions of Good Vibrations up to this point and gone up, 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 and up. So by the time you get back to the bridge, you get to the chorus and you're going down. Now, he has this wild first bridge and then just kind of drops you into this sort of sense of calm and quiet. And the pulse starts building up. And everything's just, the minimalism of it and the quietness of it and the slower tempo, just, it's like setting up a volleyball to get spiked over the net. And then when you get to that suspended chord of the E flat over F and the vocals come in, and then that little break, which he tried to do in The Little Girl I Once Knew, remember? Brian tried to put in some dead air in Little Girl I Once Knew, and the single failed because it was too long. But here, it's just a breath. It's just the right length. And what didn't work in Little Girl I Once Knew, the pause, is exactly what allows Good Vibrations to spike the ball over the net and have a payoff at the end that just makes you go, yes, yes. And then Brian has solved the riddle. Once he has that September 1st session and he realizes the bridge has to come down, have something that draws you in so that, and you're going, what? And then you get that, and then Good Vibrations, and we're in. And that's when Brian now he has solved the arrangement problem. He's figured out how the pieces fit together, and now he can finish the track. So he edits the whole thing together. The verses were from the very first session. The choruses from June 2nd. The first bridge from May 4th. Church organ on September 1st. As I just said, the bridge and choruses from May 27th. So I believe that's 3, 4, 5 different sessions that Brian used. And there's an edit also on the final version. There's a couple edits of the master where I think you don't really hear it so much now, because I went to listen for it on recent versions. I've smoothed it over, but for years, hearing this on the radio, you could hear this, that I love the colorful clothes she wears. And then there's a tonal change. And then he's edited the master of the track from one studio to another because he liked how the reverb went on the first line, and then changed the second line. It's kind of a jarring edit because the whole track just kind of changes there. And that's not reflected in my notes here, but I know it happened. So sorry, I should have had this ready when I went to, I should have run this down before I taped this, but there are some circumstances around this taping where I kind of need to get it done right now. So whatever happened here, I'll explain it up here. But so even with the final edit, there's some pretty, there was an edit within the verse. I remember that, between the first and second lines, and it was kind of a pretty shocking little, if you're paying attention, it's like the Strawberry Fields Forever thing, like you don't notice it until you notice it, and then you're like, oh, how did I miss that, right? The band, the entire six-piece group sings on it, at least on the chorus. Carl does the lead vocal on the verses with a little help from Brian on the top note. Mike does the choruses with I'm picking up good vibrations. And Brian does some counterpoint on the bridge, and that's pretty much what we got. Final vocals were on September 12th. The final overdub and vocal session was September 21st. They did the mix down that day. Brian talks about how when they finally got the final mix and he just sat back and listened to it, and he said, oh my God. And he knew he had it. He just knew. And there's some interesting reactions from the rest of the band. Bruce Johnston said, we're either going to have the biggest hit in the world or the Beach Boys' career is over. Because that's how radical this song was. Everyone could tell it was special. And everyone could tell there was something really compelling about it, but it was so revolutionary relative to what was on the radio at the time that it was a big risk. And Bruce was right. Not only did it become a massive hit, but it did mark the end of their careers in terms of the momentum and the hit-making role that they were on. This was their the last of the crown jewels of the Beach Boys' early hit run. They did have hits after this and some big ones overseas, but in terms of, at least in the American market, this was their last biggie until a couple of stray ones came later in the 70s and 80s. So it was the biggest hit in the world, and their career was kind of over in terms of the career that they had had up till that point. Their career was going to be not over, but it's going to be very different after this. Things are going to change a lot. Capitol was a little unsure. They'd been pushing for it earlier, but they're kind of like, could we have another Barbara Ann, please? And this is what they had. They didn't really have a choice. They've been waiting all this time for something new from the guys, and now they finally had it, and this was what it was, and they had to roll the dice. And they put it out, and the reaction was, well, we'll go into that in a minute. But before we get too far into how Good Vibrations carried the band into the last half of '66 and what the aftermath of it was, let's do a musical breakdown of the songwriting part of Good Vibrations. Once this was all put together, and once Brian figured out how he wanted it to go, what were the building blocks that Brian used to make this first modular pop single? Without any further ado, I will turn it over to our resident musical analyst, me. So Carl Wilson once said in an interview that Good Vibrations was actually one of the simplest songs the Beach Boys had ever done. It was just the way it was put together that gave it the illusion of being complex. And this is one of these things people say and you hear and you kind of go, oh yeah, right. But actually, he's kind of right, and it's hard to understand that until you break the song down, which I'm going to do right now. So if you watch the episodes I did about the Pet Sounds album and the music breakdowns I did and some of the crazy chords and crazy roots that Brian used in making some of those songs, like God Only Knows and I Just Wasn't Made For These Times, there's nothing like that here. Everything is pretty straight triads. So it starts out with just an E flat minor basic triad. Now the lead line is in the bass, da 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 da. So in that respect, it is like Pet Sounds in that most of the melodic interest in the basic track is on the bass. The bass is kind of doing a lead line, but the chords underneath it, the organ you hear, is just E flat minor straight up. Then it goes to the relative minor, which is a B flat minor, but the implication is that it's a D flat in the bass. It's a whole step modulation down. Implied, it's like this. So that's what we hear. Basically, whole step modulation down twice and a half step in the last one in major triads. That's not quite what happens on the record because he's actually playing minor chords. So it's like this. E flat minor straight up, B flat minor with the implied D flat in the bass, then A flat minor with the B in the bass, and then B flat major. But even with these games with a minor, whether it's a minor or a major, it's all pretty conventional because you're implying a straight modulation down. And even if you throw the minors in, it's just minor triads descending. E flat to the relative minor to a whole step modulation down, and then a half step modulation resolving to the major chord. And the second time through, we get a transitional D flat dominant 7, which sets us up for the second section, which is the chorus. Now in the chorus, all the action is with the theremin line, the woo-woo machine, and the bass. But the chord structure, it's buried way deep on the organ, is basic boogie woogie. That's all it is. Again, the illusion of complexity because the actual chord, it's as basic as it gets. It's the same boogie woogie progression that the Wilson brothers were taught by their mom, Audrey. And what does Brian do with this? He just modulates it up a whole step every time, which is very similar to what we saw in California Girls, where the whole thing is the whole step modulations, right? Right? So now he's flipping that on its head. So it's F sharp major, then A flat major, then B flat major. So again, you've got all this stuff going on around it, and the theremin and the triplets on the cello, which is a new thing for Brian, that kind of digga-da triplet thing on the cello, which gives the track a lot of its power. That's not something we've heard him do before, and it was supposedly suggested by Van Dyke Parks or possibly Carl, but I kind of think it's a Van Dyke Parks idea. It's not a Brian thing, at least not yet, but it will become part of Smile. You hear a lot more cello action in Smile and songs like The Old Master Painter or Cabin Essence. The cello is the lead instrument. We've heard this, we did hear this a little bit before, but this is taking it up another notch. So that all repeats, and then when we get through the second chorus, then we get to the third part, and what are we doing here? Now we do have this little wild thing here with the C in the right hand, making, I don't know what you would call that, a B flat dominant 7, add 2, subtract 3. But get rid of the C, and what have we got? Just this. What is it? It's just the same boogie woogie thing we had backwards. And we haven't even done anything revolutionary with the key because he modulated up from G flat to A flat to B flat, and now we're in the B flat key. All we're doing is, and then going to the fourth, except it's really this. But again, get rid of this note, it's just this. the same boogie woogie progression that we had. So you start to see what Carl was talking about. So then what's the last part we have to deal with? Well, not the last part, but the next part, which is the organ part, which is played by Dennis. Dennis had learned to play keyboards properly from Bruce Johnston on their Japan tour. You can see a picture on the back of Pet Sounds of Bruce and Dennis at the piano. And this is where Dennis really started to blossom into songwriting, because he, like Brian and Carl, had learned this basic from Audrey, but he didn't have much more than that until Bruce showed him more chords, and that's when we get the flowering of Dennis Wilson as a writer. So for the first time, to my knowledge, we have Dennis on the keyboard. So he's playing, I believe it's this. I believe that's the voicing, although I couldn't 100% swear to it. Coming out of the part prior to that, we were in B flat, right? Now we're just dropping to F, which is the 5 of the B flat, a very conventional move. So even though Brian is changing keys all over the place, there's nothing that shocking about the keys that he's changing or the moves that he's making. They're all set up very conventionally. And so you've basically got F major chord, then just a straight G minor chord, and then a C7. So again, very, very conventional chords. F, G minor, C7, no third in that from what I can tell. The only wild chord we get, the only crazy root we get, is when we get to the which is an E flat over F on the vocals. Although it sounds to me like Dennis is playing something like this. I don't hear an E flat on the organ track, so it's either this or this. Didn't dive that deep, but I didn't hear an E flat. So the chord under it, I believe, is a C minor 7 over, what would you call that? Anyway, these notes. But basically, it winds up being an E flat over F, or an E flat 6 over F, I guess, is what it would be with what's on the organ. But anyway, that's the only wild chord we get. And then we have the F in the bass. So where does that lead us? We go back to the chorus, but now it's backwards because we're going from the F to B flat, which again, very conventional move. B flat is the 4 of the F. So now we do the chorus backwards, modulating down. Good, 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 good vibrations. Good, 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 good vibrations. Then we get the which is really interesting because it's just one bass note. Very, very simple. And again, this points the way to Smile, because Smile is going to see Brian stripping down a lot of the artifice of Pet Sounds and getting into really minimalist sounds, including the sound of one note, like you have in Vegetables, and a few other things. So he's just hitting quarter note, 1, 2, I guess half notes, isn't it? So, I guess it's quarters or halves, depending how you break up the bar. I don't know. But anyway, it's real simple. Same modulation. And then back down to A flat, which is where we wind up. That's also a little unconventional in the sense we wind up in the middle of the modulation for the ending of the song. It just rides the A flat down. Now, in one of the earlier versions of Good Vibrations, there's some dissonant clarinet stuff that added some tonal complexity to what is there, and Brian ditched it, and I think wisely, because that kind of sort of fussy dissonant stuff was part of what made Pet Sounds a little commercially off-putting. But here, the song is all kind of about dressing up something very basic and having that dissonant clarinet stuff in there. I think it was clarinets. I could be wrong. Don't write me in if it's something else. I think that kind of messed with the song a bit. And there's a lot of other stuff that Brian tried in his months of experimentation that he discarded, and I think wisely so. But at the end of the day, although it's revolutionary in terms of the care that Brian put into it and the instrumental combinations and the instruments that were used, the chords underneath it, really straightforward. It's just As Carl said, how it's put together gives it the illusion of complexity because you have all of these really simple little building blocks, but they all fit together really well. And this gets us to the method Brian wanted to employ in Smile, where you hear a lot of these little riffs, and a lot of them are very, very simple. They're not super crazy chords like Pet Sounds had. They're just, sometimes they're like one to four, like, something like, something like, that's not really from Smile, but I'm just giving you an idea how the little bits and pieces Brian did for Smile, a lot of them weren't crazy complex with weird chords and everything like that. A lot of them were real simple. So with Good Vibrations, it's a real simple song. This is the verse. This is the chorus. Right? This is the bridge. This is the breakdown. Basically, those aren't exact voicings, but I'm just trying to dumb it down to show you. Each of these building blocks, they're among, as Carl said, the simplest chord progressions the Beach Boys ever did, or at least had done since their very earliest days. So Good Vibrations, a revolutionary record, but part of its commercial appeal was its underlying simplicity. So now that we've discussed the musical part of the songwriting process for Good Vibrations, let's look at the lyrics just a little bit. Mike Love has frequently credited himself for taking a fairly radical sounding track and bringing it back down to earth and sort of using his common touch as a lyricist to make the song a big hit. And he will frequently point to this as evidence of the vitality of his creative contribution to the Beach Boys. And is this justified or not? Well, like most things about Mike, which are controversial, my opinion is that Mike probably overrates his contribution a little bit, but people also underrate the degree to which he has a valid point. Mike will talk about how he came up with I'm Picking Up Good Vibrations hook. Sort of, but I mean, it was already there with the bass line, so he didn't actually write the melody. He did pick up on the potential of the bass melody as a hook and brought it to the forefront, and that's a valid contribution, but he didn't write the melody. So that's kind of an example of what I'm talking about. Mike did something, it wasn't nothing, but it wasn't quite as big as it's sort of made to seem. Likewise, with the lyrics, they're much better than Asher's, although, as I said, Asher has a line or two in there that, got kept. Maybe should have thrown him a bone there in the credits, but, at the time, I guess it didn't seem that important. But I would say, in a way, Mike almost doesn't give himself enough credit, in a way, because he talks about how he just brings it down to the boy-girl message, the standard love song thing, which Brian bemoaned a little bit. He was almost apologetic about it in an interview at the time because he's trying to progress, right? He's trying to be with the times, and he says, well, it's the same boy-girl thing, but it's different. It's a start, and that's kind of where Brian was at with it. But as I've said before, Mike's lyrics are surprisingly very much of the times or anticipating the times. It's almost the first, I don't know the chronology of these things, but it's one of the first sort of flower power love songs. You can tell this is kind of a hippie chick that is bringing about all these good vibrations as a dreamy quality, both to the way Carl sings it and to the words Mike brings to it, like the Blossom World line. That's great, She goes with me to a blossom world, and that conjures up this whole, I'm floating in a sea of flowers. I mean, how much more with the whole flower child ethos could you possibly get? And in fact, Good Vibrations, even after the Beach Boys' Fall from Grace, it remained one of the only songs of theirs that throughout their whole unhip period that the counterculture accepted and found valid. I remember my brother, who was born in '57 and very much into Hendrix and Zeppelin and all that stuff. Uriah Heep, you know, it was his deal. He's a musician also, and I'm not dissing him. He's a very fine musician, but we have very different musical tastes and different musical biases. And I can remember him telling me when I was getting into the Beach Boys that the only Beach Boys songs he could listen to with any pleasure were Good Vibrations and Sail On Sailor, which were pretty much the only two Beach Boys that were accepted by the underground. And I think Mike, when he talks about the conventionality of the lyrics he brought to it, I think in a way he's not giving himself enough credit, because the songs are very resonant with what was happening in that whole 66 to 67 Summer of Love period. A little bit like The Rain, the Park, and the Other Things by the Castles, which I'm pretty sure came later, but it's that same sort of, I'm not just in love with a girl, I'm in love with this wild, strange woman. He made a conventional love song that still was very cutting edge for the times and very resonant of the times as that they were on the cusp of. So Brian was right when he says it's the same old boy-girl thing, but it's different. It was. Now, Mike's lyrics, you know, there's a couple of clinkers in there that Brian was cringed out by the "giving me excitations" line, and it's pretty cringeworthy, to be honest. There's no such thing as excitations. Brian tried to get Van Dyke to write some new lyrics again because he was not happy with this. And Van Dyke made a really good point that no one cares about the lyrics once they hear the music. So that's Van Dyke taking the counterpoint to Mike's opinion that his lyrics were what made it commercial. Who was right? Who was wrong? I think the truth lies in the middle. I don't think the song would have been a hit with Tony Asher's lyrics, or it wouldn't have been as big of a hit. But it's like every other thing about this song. Every iteration of this song had potential, but only the final version, with Mike's words, with the slow bridge, with it assembled just the way that it was, worked. But when he got it all together, all that effort, he finally got it, and he made, it's arguably the most perfect pop single ever made. It's that good. So, you know, Mike deserves some credit for that. He took part in it. You know, how much you want to assign to him, I don't know. But like Peter Tork once said about his role in the Monkees, and the Monkees as a band, he said, "We weren't nothing, we were something." What Mike did wasn't nothing, it was something. So speaking of its commercial prospects and impact, basically this was a game changer for the Beach Boys, because Pet Sounds had hit in England, and the Beach Boys were riding a wave of respect there, but it had performed disappointingly in the States. They were fighting a dual battle with the ingrained image Americans had of them as the whole striped shirt surfing thing, and also Capitol's desire to continue to promote them that way because it was much easier to do. Now, Brian had a song that was inarguably progressive and different, and very much not just of the times, but anticipating the times to come. That's the big, I mean, Brian was looking into the future with this single, and it was a time where everybody was looking into the future and seeing that music was exploding. It was in a very fertile creative time. And this song pointed the way to new possibilities. As one reviewer in the 70s said, Brian showed that pop could be art and be fun too, thus beating the counterculture at their own game. That pretty much sums it up. Brian found a way to make the whole, he did it a little bit with Wouldn't It Be Nice too, where he still had enough of a toe in their prior image and it being kind of fun and uplifting and romantic, and that it didn't conflict with the prior image of the Beach Boys, but was still undeniably a progressive and forward-looking and revolutionary song. Everybody saw that, and when the song hit #1, it became a phenomenon worldwide, but in America especially. Now Capitol went, okay, point proven, let's see this Smile record you got, because this looks like there might be money here. And then in England, imagine how the situation was there, where Pet Sounds was a major hit there. God Only Knows and Sloop John B. also major hits. The Beach Boys had already closed the deal in Britain in terms of their stature as artists. And they didn't have as much baggage to overcome from the prior perceptions of the band because they didn't really break through big in England until 65, 66. So the Beach Boys to the British were a progressive pop band and at the very forefront of this movement. So now with this song, the Brits were like, oh my God, they've cracked the code. And it's hard to believe now, but at the end of 66, in Britain, in the New Musical Express poll, the Beatles were beaten by the Beach Boys, narrowly, but nonetheless beaten, for the world's top pop group. In 66, after Rubber Soul and Revolver, and they hadn't had Sgt. Pepper yet, but they were big. But the Beach Boys were perceived to be at the very forefront by the British of what was going on. And it wasn't just there. Russia, Europe, Japan, the Philippines, according to Wikipedia, I didn't know any of this myself, also voted them the world's top group because of Pet Sound, the 1-2 punch of Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations. By the end of 66, everybody was on board. They were like, okay, Brian, now we see what you're doing. Arty kind of people were kind of leaning in. Americans reluctantly, British eagerly. The Suits, the powers that be, were like, this is a huge hit, yay, so we're willing to go with this. And this paves the way for the next project, which is Smile, which by the end of 66, everybody is dying to hear what comes after this. Because Good Vibrations was such an undeniable record, not just as a hit, but it was the Bohemian Rhapsody of its time, if you will. Think about the impact that song has had and why it's had that kind of impact. At the time that song came out, no one had really done a song like that. But therein lay the rub, because look at how difficult it was for Brian to put this all together and how much time it took and how expensive it was. And now he was expected to do a whole album of equally groundbreaking material. And he was now using this modular approach for everything. And this was going to have ramifications. But with Good Vibrations, it's important to understand that at the end of 66, when Good Vibrations was sitting at the top of the charts around the world, everything was lined up. Like the Beach Boys were ready to take the baton of the world, the most progressive pop group in the world. And we get a little caught up in the question of what kind of impact would the Smile album have had it been released? Would American psychedelia have been more like the Beach Boys and less like Jefferson Airplane had Smile taken hold? Would the Beach Boys have been acknowledged as creative equals to the Beatles in their time as opposed to belatedly 50 years later? I think all that misses a certain point, that at that one moment, November, December, going into the beginning of January, the Beach Boys were already there. And it was all down to what they did next. Had they released Smile, people talk about, well, would it have been as big as Sgt. Pepper's? Would it have not have been as big as Sgt. Pepper's? I feel like I have a pretty good idea how it would have done, and I'll talk about that when we talk about Smile. But in a funny way, it wouldn't have mattered even if the band went down the same path they went down anyway with Wild Honey and everything, which I think they probably would have done. The problem was the mantle that they briefly claimed, where they pulled everything together, they were able to make this impossible case for themselves as artists in their time. I'm not talking about now, I'm talking about them. If you are thought of a certain way and you suddenly act a different way, people are going to react very differently to you, and they'll probably react more harshly than if you had acted that way all along. So when the Beach Boys took a right turn in 1967 and didn't follow through in sort of defending their heavyweight crown against the Beatles and all other comers in 67, that affected the perception of the band, and that contextualized everything they did after that in a negative light, in America at least. Less so worldwide, but certainly people were expecting them to follow up on Good Vibrations in all the promise and the grandeur and the new directions it showed, and they didn't deliver. It's nothing to do with the quality of the music that they recorded. They didn't put it out, and by the time they did put it out in piecemeal form, it was kind of too late. The world had moved on. They weren't listening anymore. But that doesn't... The funny thing about it is, even though the Beach Boys lost the plot very fast after Good Vibrations, in fact, almost as soon as the calendar flips from 66 into 67, you can see things begin to fall apart. And it's funny because I've talked about this in the Pet Sounds. Like, we think of 66 in Pet Sounds as being where things start to fall apart for the Beach Boys. No. The Beach Boys were still huge all the way through 66. Especially with Good Vibrations, they were bigger than ever. But the minute we flip into 67 and Good Vibrations starts to fall down the charts, and the wait for Smile begins, the clock is ticking because other things are going on. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Good Vibrations was an amazing record. And even as the band's fall from grace began, and they became more and more of a joke in the States, no one ever denied the greatness of this song, ever. Like my brother, when he said that to me around 1980 when the Beach Boys were, again, kind of a joke at that point. But no one ever argued with the greatness of this song. Nobody. Moving ahead into the future, there are only two significant cover versions of this song that had any kind of chart success. Todd Rundgren covered it in 1976 and had a top 40 hit. A very faithful rendition. I think it's actually on his album Faithful, if I remember correctly. Wilson Phillips, obviously Brian's daughters, and China Phillips had a number 25 adult contemporary hit with it in 2012. But perhaps also the Trogs did a very funny version of it, I think in 73, 74. It's worth digging up. Didn't hit, but it's pretty amazing. But possibly the biggest lift for modern recognition of the song came in the late 70s when Sunkist, which was an orange soda, or was it orange soda or an orange drink? It was an orange something, an orange beverage, used Good Vibrations as their theme song for their commercials for the product. And for those of you that weren't around then, this was huge. Some band had recorded their own version of Good Vibrations, went bubbly, 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 bubbly. So I guess it was orange soda that Sunkist had. And they did this sort of pre-digital stutter. It was like, Temptations, that I think the Beach Boys even adopted for a little while live. But that's the Good Vibrations in the Sunkist commercials in the late 70s. I was a kid, but I remember it was ubiquitous. You could not escape it. It was just there. So it almost became a hit all over again. And you'll see how prominent it became in their sets in the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, they always did it, but it was a little more of a centerpiece than it had been prior to that. And there was when I was going down to Wikipedia on this, there was a hilarious quote from Mike Love I really want to share. I guess it's from his autobiography, which I've yet to read, but I'm planning to read it before I get into the Smile stuff. Where apparently Mike was happy to take the money from Sunkist, but he hated Sunkist, the drink. And he told some executive that, quote, if I was driving my Range Rover through the Mojave Desert and it broke down, I would first drain my radiator fluid and drink that before I had a Sunkist. Wow, Mike, that's a way to bite the hand that feeds you, but that's very, very funny. I don't remember it being that bad. But anyway, Good Vibrations is regarded as one of the very greatest pop or rock recordings of all time in music history. It was elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as one of the songs that shaped rock and roll in 2006. On Rolling Stone's Greatest Songs of All Time, it ranks number 6. That's pretty good. So You know, I've been talking apparently for an hour, 15, hour 20 about one song, you know, and as long-winded as I am, I didn't find it difficult because there's probably a lot of things I didn't say that could be said about Good Vibrations, but it deserves its stature. And in fact, like so many things with this series, going back and researching it, I was like, Good Vibrations. You know, when the Good Vibrations box set came out, it's just like, why do I want to hear 18 different versions of Good Vibrations? But listening to the sequence of the sessions and having some production experience myself and kind of seeing how the wheels were turning in Brian's head really made me understand a lot more Brian's creative process. And even though it seems like he's pissing away all this money and he's endlessly experimenting, and he said at the time he wanted to do something new, and the more he got into it, the more he wanted to get into it, which again, continue with Smile. But there was a logic to the process. There was a logical reason, as I said, why he went to the modular form of recording. He did want to make a classical, what he called a pocket symphony, a classical influenced pop record, yes. But the modular recording helped him work out his ideas for each individual section. And as I said before, every change he made was in reaction to a way that the track had not been working up to that point. Everybody saw the potential of this song from the very beginning, but the torturous road Brian took, listening to where he started with it and where he wound up and how he got there, even though it's an enormous amount of money to spend, an enormous amount of time, the song really did need that level of experimentation. And so that is certainly plenty of talk about Good Vibrations. Basically, this is a pivotal moment in the band's history. It's a peak. Brian called it at the time a plateau. That's how he viewed it, a place he had gotten to, and he was going to be on it for a while, and then he was going to keep climbing. That's not how it worked out. This is the pinnacle of the Beach Boys' original commercial and artistic ascension. And starting from now, things will begin to fall apart and come back together in kind of interesting ways. And I just want to say personally, I've been looking forward to getting to this point since I started this series quite a while ago, because much as I respect and venerate the Beach Boys, well, everything they did, they're a pretty amazing and interesting band. The music that is closest to my heart, that I'm most excited to listen to again, the music that won me over, is the music that starts after the release of Good Vibrations. Everything from Smile up to the Light album in 1979, that's the period of the band's history I find the most fascinating. It's where the other personalities of the band come to the fore. It's where the music takes on a more modern tone. The progressions get less shiny. The musical ideas are a little darker. There's a little more edge to what the band does. Things get weird. And my favorite kind of music is when pop music gets weird. So I'm really looking forward to what comes next. But I do want to ask you guys to give me a little time for this next episode. I've been looking forward to getting into Smile for a long time, actually more than I was looking forward to the Pet Sounds thing, which was a pretty big task. Smile is one of the most talked about mysteries in the history of pop music. And there's no way, rather like Pet Sounds, I'll ever be able to absorb the intricacies of every single session and every single nuance of what was recorded for it. But I do have an idea of how I want to approach it, and I need to get up to speed on a lot of things and do some solid research to be able to give you the best possible and most informed show I can give you, which is always my goal here. I'm not thinking Smile is going to be a 5-episode thing. I'm thinking more like 2 episodes, because I'm not going to do a song-by-song analysis per se. There will be, because we don't have an album, so we don't even know what the finished songs were. So be patient with me. I'm on a break right now, which is enabling me to catch up with my video work, but I'm pretty busy working as a performer these days. I want to enjoy this process, so be patient with me as I get the research done. And I will be back with, I hope, very cool examination of the Beach Boys' unfinished and mysterious album project that follows Good Vibrations' Smile. So be patient. It'll take a little while to get here, but it'll be worth the wait. Thanks so much, and if you want to become a patron of the channel, contribute, help keep the show going, check the first comment. Very much appreciate you all watching, and I'll see you soon.